Week one of the college football season will be here before we know it, but before we get there, let's check in on some preseason storylines. Welcome into the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside the Knoxville News Sentinels, Adam Sparks and John Adams. Adam has been doing the Lord's work going out to preseason camp the past few weeks. Adam, we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty position battles, areas of concern for Tennessee that are jumping out, but broad strokes, I think most Vols fans want to know, how's Nico looking in preseason practice, and just anything else that really jumps out to you before we get into some of the more specifics of position battles and areas of concern.
Yeah, the Pepto Nico episode is over. The stomach bug that kept him out of the last scrimmage has come and gone. A lot of people freaked out about Nico not being in the second scrimmage. I mean, you guys know as well as I do that, like, internally we know, like, page views, how many times somebody clicks on a story, reads a story, whatever. The most page views, I think, of any story I've written in fall camp so far was just saying that Nico had a stomach bug and that he was out of practice one day. Because that's, I mean, I guess part of that is just the name Nico that does well anytime you type it in a headline. But I guess the other is I would say an underlying fear of what happens to the season if he were suddenly not available. And I know that'll probably be another podcast. But I mean, that's Nico looks great when he's not sick. The offense looks as good as you would think it would. I still have a lot of questions about Tennessee secondary, and I know we're going to get into that here in a little bit. But I mean, I think this team is ready to play. Considering it's playing Chattanooga in the opener, I know it's ready to play. Beyond that, we'll see. They closed up practice to media late last week, and so we saw a lot, and then they shut the doors, and since then, who knows what's going on? But I think the hay is in the barn for the most part. There's a few unanswered questions that I know we'll get to, though.
John, I want to follow up on what Adam's talking about with Nico, just that example of how much fan attention is on him. He gets a stomach bug and misses a scrimmage, and it's a headline story, one of the biggest headline stories in Knoxville. Can you think back? I mean, was this similar to the buzz for Peyton Manning when he arrived? I know Nico's been here for a season, but it was understood he was probably not going to be the starter this year, and now that he is, I guess what compares for you in terms of anticipation for a quarterback taking over, like we're seeing, from the fan base with Nico? Is Peyton a comparison, or does something else stand out to you? And I realize with Peyton, it was a different time before social media, but what comparisons stand out?
Yeah, really, you can't compare the two because of social media. But there was great anticipation about Peyton. However, he played the last half of the previous season as a freshman, so he was coming into his sophomore season. But I do remember, in terms of Peyton, you can call it Peyton mania, when he came back for his senior season. That's back when we put out a huge preseason football section. And that thing was way larger than anything we'd produced. And of course, as you know, that's incumbent upon how much advertising do you get as to how many pages you have. And it was full of ads because this is the return of Peyton when he could have gone pro and probably would have been the first player picked. But he chose to return for a final season, and Tennessee fans were eternally grateful. But now in this era where this is anticipation on steroids, I think what's so interesting about Nico is we go back to his signing. When Peyton Manning signed, it was a big deal, but Tennessee also signed another quarterback, Brandon Stewart, who was rated just almost as highly as Peyton was. A guy from Texas, played at in the largest classification school in Texas. So there was tremendous anticipation about both. But now, I mean, just the thing with Nico, Peyton nobody was speculating on the NIL package Peyton Manning got. So you had that as a lead in, and all the speculation. He's a $2 million man leading up to before he's ever played a game. And then when you think about how he's just been a catalyst for headlines, because throughout last season, there was always kind of this undercurrent of, well, do you give Nico a chance now? How have we seen enough of this offense with Joe Milton, who was okay, but who wasn't running an offense that was producing 40 points a game? I guess it was producing about 31. But so there's been all these things going on with Nico, and then he gets to play in the bowl, and he's an MVP in the bowl game. First game he ever starts, and he's the MVP of it. So now we've had an off season of anticipation. I don't think Tennessee's ever seen anything like this.
Blake, I've got a take on that. Sort of a comp to Nico, and this is fresh in my mind because I've been working on a Nico feature story for the season preview that'll be out probably next week. I think Nico's second year, I think, is a combination between Peyton Manning and Condredge Holloway. Let me unpack that a little bit. Peyton came to campus with a name recognition. He's Archie Manning's son. He's at that time what would be considered a 5-star quarterback. So he comes in already carrying his name. He's already a brand to some extent. So that he's not an unknown. So in that way, I think Nico is similar. Although Nico's was not achieved through his dad's name, his was achieved through NIL and a lot of recruiting stories about him. So that part is like Peyton. Now, of course, the difference that John mentioned is Peyton started 8 games as a freshman. Nico started 1, didn't play that much. The Condredge Holloway side of it is that Condredge did not play on varsity as his freshman year because in 1971, you weren't allowed, NCAA didn't allow freshmen to play. But Condredge, there was a buzz around campus and around the program for an entire year while everybody waited for him to take the helm that second year. There was a game, it was like the last year that freshmen played JV, just freshman team in 71, and Condredge played in a freshman game. I think it was against Notre Dame at Neyland Stadium, and over 30,000 people showed up for a freshman scrimmage because there was just this tremendous buzz about, hey, forget this year. Next year, Condredge is taking over. And that's the sense that I get sort of from Nico. We saw little glimpses of him last year, and we did see the one Citrus Bowl, but everything was the build up to year 2. And that part of it, I think, is like Condredge. If you combine Peyton and Condredge, how they were in their first year going into the second, I think the combination of those two is closest to Nico.
I think there was also tremendous anticipation about Heath Shuler, his first season as a starter, because he was a highly acclaimed, great high school athlete, not just a great quarterback. And he pretty much lived up to the billing. So, yeah, it's there have been a few of those guys, but nothing like Nico. And what's interesting about Nico, too, Blake, is you think about Peyton Manning. I guess Peyton was listed as 6'5", and Nico's 6'6", but Peyton couldn't run like this. Just Nico's look, the oddity of having a 6'6" guy, and we saw it in the Citrus Bowl, who's so shifty and quick. It's an odd combination, and I think that adds to the intrigue about what he'll be like as a full-time player.
All the quarterbacks we're talking about are guys that it's sort of wins above replacement, right? WAR in baseball. It's if you have them, you're going to get another win or 2 more wins. Without them, you're worse. I think that's what we're saying about Peyton, about Condredge, about Shuler, that they can turn a 7-5 team into an 8-4, 8-4 into a 9-3. I think that's what the conversation is around Nico, that if you have an average quarterback on this team, maybe it's 8-4. With Nico, people think it could maybe be 10-2. I think that's the difference. And the thing is, we only seen him play. He played like 50 snaps before the Citrus Bowl. So we're really, really putting a lot of expectations on a small window that we've seen him in. But everybody that's seen the glimpses of him were like, yep, he's the real deal. I haven't talked to anybody. I mean, that's coach, media, analyst, anybody that's seen Nico up close and seen him practice and play that say, I don't get the Nico thing. 100% of people, he's batting 1,000 on impressions with people. Everybody thinks this is going to be a really, really good quarterback. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah, it's interesting, guys. USA Today this week released a list of their top 10 quarterbacks entering the season, not for the SEC, but for the entire country. And I thought it was a pretty good list, pretty fair list, but Nico was not on that top 10 list. And I think Nico should be on this list. And that speaks to the level of expectations that we have for him, despite the limited number of snaps he's played, because I think we all have a pretty good feel, or at least think we do, for his abilities, and we're all pretty high on them. But some other areas of the roster to get into moving beyond quarterback, let's look at running back and Tennessee's quest, I guess, to find a second running back to kind of headline that rotation. So, Adam, what's the update on Cam Seldon? His injury situation, is he full go or not? I know Josh Heupel spoke about this in a recent press conference, but what's sort of the interpretation of that situation with Cam Seldon?
Yeah, so when practice closed up last week, we saw Cam Seldon in a red jersey, meaning no contact. That's the way we've seen him all of camp. He had shoulder surgery in spring practice, and the idea was that he was going to be out early in the season, probably come back, week 2, week 3, whatever, of the season. And then after practice was closed a couple days ago, Josh Heupel answered. It was the last question of the press conference, and somebody asked him about the health of the running backs. I think he let it slip. I don't think he intentionally meant to say it, but he said Peyton Lewis, another running back that had shoulder surgery, Peyton Lewis and Cam Seldon are both full go. And then he was immediately, follow-up questions were shouted at him of what that means. Does that mean he can take contact? He's cleared for contact. And you could see a big grin come across Josh Heupel's face, because, again, I don't think he meant to let it out that Cam Seldon was ready to go. And he said he's full go. He's cleared for contact. Now, the question is whether or not he plays in the opener. There's two schools of thought. There's one that says if he just got cleared for contact, this would be like 10 days before the opener. It's a shoulder injury. A running back coming back from a shoulder injury, like that's not a easy thing to do. One school of thought says you hold him out for a little while to make sure that thing gets as close to 100% as possible, because you don't want him taking a shot in the shoulder against Chattanooga and suddenly he's out for another month or two. And he's their second best running back behind Dylan Sampson. The other school of thought is if you think he's full go and you think he can play, you want him to play against NC State in the second game. Well, if he's going to do that, you might as well shake off the rust against Chattanooga, an inferior opponent. Let him get 2 or 3 carries. Let him pass block a couple times. Let him get 10 snaps in there so that he's ready for NC State. And I don't know which one they're going to do. I think if he plays against Chattanooga, it's 100% because they need him in that week 2 game. If he doesn't, I think they're saying, I don't know if he's ready yet. Let's let him rest a little bit.
John, what's your level of concern about Tennessee's running back depth? Because when you compare it year over year, last year they had a really strong 1-2 punch with Jalen Wright and Dylan Sampson, and then Jabari Small was there kind of as the number 3. Now Dylan Sampson moves up to the number 1 spot, and I think, I feel pretty good about what Tennessee has there on their front line running back. But behind them, it's Cam Seldon and mostly unproven guys. What's your thoughts on sort of that running back rotation, and how much of a concern is that or isn't that for Tennessee's offense?
Oh, I think it's one of the biggest concerns about this team. You're right. I think Dylan Sampson is going to be very good. I think he'll be a better running back than what Tennessee had last year. But he's got to stay healthy. The problem is behind him. If I'm going into, ideally, if I were a coach going into an SEC season and I have high expectations, high aspirations, I'd want to have 4 proven running backs. I know that's asking a lot, but I know what it's like to get through this league. And I've seen teams, some of those really good Georgia teams, And some of those really good Alabama teams, when you looked at their running back depth chart, and when you saw the running back they can put in the game in the fourth quarter when the game's out of hand, and he's better than some running backs in the SEC, that's what you really want and kind of what you need. So I think that could be a problem. It's not a problem if Dylan Sampson stays healthy, of course, but you just don't know. And I've seen teams that go into a season and they've got 4 or 5 running backs, and next thing you know, they're down to 2. The depth, the attrition at that position can just really erode your depth, and it can erode it fast. So, yeah, this is a very real concern, I think, for Tennessee.
Well, let's stay on the topic of depth and health of the roster and move to Brew McCoy, the most veteran receiver in this rotation, someone who's been a high performer for Tennessee in the past. You think back to the 2022 season and some of the big performances he had in that special year for Tennessee. Came up huge in that win against LSU, as I recall, one of the biggest games of the season for him. Had good numbers against Missouri that year as well. And then last year played just the first month of the season, a serious ankle injury. Adam, what's the situation for him? Should we expect him to be 100%, come season opener, or where's he at in his recovery?
Well, as we record this, Brew has not talked to the media yet during camp. Now, by the time this publishes, will be probably around the time he talks. He's talking this week to the media for the first time, and that was strategic. Tennessee was going to wait until he felt good and he looked good and that he could say he's 100% or close to it before they put him in front of media. And he's to that point now. When we saw him, when practices were open, we would see him run one route and catch a ball on the first day. And then the second day he would run 3 routes and catch 3 passes. And they would really inch him along in that way. By the time the practice closed last week, if you had not told me that he had an injury the previous year, I would not have known it. Looks the part, cuts well. People that are listening to this pod remember it was a gruesome injury that he suffered last year against, was it South Carolina? Just one of those where the foot turns the wrong direction it's supposed to turn, and just a really severe injury. And you can't tell it. You really can't tell it to the naked eye of how he's running.
Okay, so that sounds like good news for Tennessee, good news for Brew McCoy. And as I look at the wide receiver rotation for Tennessee, sort of the 3 headliners, and I know there's some guys that may get some snaps behind them, but the 3 headliners: Brew McCoy, Squirrel White, who led the team in receptions last year by a big margin, and then Chris Brazzell, the transfer from Tulane. Adam, you had a nice story on him over at KnoxNews this week. Of those 3, it's a tough call, but I think I would pick maybe Squirrel White to lead the team in receptions because he had, the big lead last year. He had 67 catches last year. What do you got? If you had to pick one of those 3, or I guess if you want to throw a wild card out there, surprise me and do it. But if you had to pick one of those 3, who's going to lead this team in receptions?
Receptions, I think, will be Squirrel. He was very productive last year, and he plays the slot, which that's in this offense, the slot gets a lot of looks, and they've emphasized so much throwing the ball over the middle, which Joe Milton did not do well last year, and still Squirrel had a ton of catches. I think if Nico is better at that, then I think Squirrel is going to lead in catches. Whether or not he leads in yards, I'm not so sure, and I don't think he leads in touchdowns. But I think just catches, total catches, I think Squirrel's your guy.
John, you want to make it unanimous for Squirrel or spice things up?
Yeah, I think it will be. I actually expected more from Squirrel White last season. And probably it's not so much a criticism of him so much, but the overall passing game, the quarterback, whatever. I thought he would have more big plays than he did. I thought he would have a higher average yards per catch than he did. But I do believe he'll be their most I think he'll have a better year and I think he'll lead the team in receptions.
Yeah, and Adam, you mentioned something I think that was really important there. Plays the slot, and that is a position that you better be ready for the ball to come your way in Josh Heupel's offense. That is you want to catch a lot of balls in this offense. I mean, it's a great offense for any receiver, but in particular, the slot's going to get a lot of catches in this system.
Yeah, and I mean, a way to get the ball to Squirrel in space where he can do something with it is to have production on the outside. And when Brew went down last year, suddenly you've got, and no offense to those guys, but you've got sort of second tier options on the outside. And so if you think about it from Tennessee's opponent's perspective of that receiving core last year, like who's going to beat me? Dante Thornton, when he was on the outside later in the season before he got hurt? Nah, I don't think he can beat me. Caleb Webb? No. Chaz Nimrod? No. Who of that receiving core late last year did you have to worry about beating you? And you saw in the Alabama game, because Squirrel got a vertical route for a touchdown, that one is Squirrel. And so if you're getting production on the outside, if you're getting Brew McCoy catching tough balls in traffic and running over people, if you're getting vertical routes from Chris Brazel, or maybe Dante Thornton, or maybe Mike Matthews, the freshman, if he gets in the mix, if you've got those guys on the outside, that suddenly opens it up more for Squirrel, and you're going to get more yards per catch from him.
Adam, a preseason narrative that we always seem to hear is, is this the year Josh Heupel goes a little bit deeper on his wide receiver rotation? Historically, Heupel does not play a ton of wide receivers, and one of the big reasons is if you're substituting during drives, you're slowing down, and Heupel wants to go fast, and faster, and so he usually sticks, for the most part, with the same three receivers throughout the drives with minimal substitution. So I've mentioned three guys kind of at the head of the rotation there, Squirrel, Chris Brazel, and Brew McCoy. Do you think it'll be a pretty tight three-man rotation, or not rotation, but the three receivers playing, or do you see the rotation extending to 4 or 5 or 6 guys realistically beyond the preseason narrative that oftentimes does not come to fruition?
In the opener against Chattanooga, I think you're going to see a lot of guys play wide receiver. And UT fans, I will just warn you, that could be fool's gold. If you look at last year, the blowout in the opener against Virginia, Tennessee played 6 wide receivers, double-digit snaps in that game. So you say, Virginia's an ACC opponent. 6 guys got in there for a whole bunch of snaps. This is going to be a deeper rotation. Game 2 against Austin Peay, 3 receivers, only 3 played double-digit snaps. So it lasted 1 week. And so do I think a lot will play in the rotation against Chattanooga? Yeah, I think the big 3 that are starting, like you said, Brew, Squirrel, Brazel. I think Chaz Nimrod will get a lot of snaps in the slot. Dante Thornton will on the outside. Mike Matthews, the 5-star. And it may go even further than that. Caleb Webb. It'll be 6 or 7 guys get double-digit snaps in that game because it'll be a blowout. NC State, week 2, I'll wait and see. And I don't think the coaching staff, I think they want to see how it goes against Chattanooga to decide if they may stretch it to 4 or 5. I think probably 4 is what we'll see once the season gets going. Because, even within the UT press corps, there's kind of this debate about Chaz Nimrod, who I think I mentioned on the pod before. Chaz Nimrod gained a bunch of strength, looks as these preseason narratives go, his body looks great, that sort of thing. We all become experts of players' physique for some reason. But he did a whole lot of really good work in the weight room in the offseason. Chaz Nimrod did. And so the idea is that, you can't keep that guy off the field. He's gonna get in the rotation. To put Chaz Nimrod on the field, you're probably going to have to take Squirrel White off of it because he's mostly going to play the slot. I don't, way to go, Chaz Nimrod. Good for you, but I just don't see them in a meaningful game. NC State, third quarter, they say, I think we're going to pull Squirrel out here. I don't think we need Squirrel out there. I just don't see that happen. I think it's probably going to be 4 guys playing. I wouldn't mind seeing more, but I think Chattanooga, you'll see 6 or 7. Wait and see NC State to see if that stays that way.
Yeah, I agree with you, Adam. I think by week 2, it'll be that typical Heupel rotation of 3 or 4 wide receivers getting all the snaps because that's what he does. And for most coaches, They don't change unless there's a significant reason to change, and I don't see a significant reason to change what Josh Heupel's been doing offensively. The tempo works when he's got the guys. I think he thinks he's got the guys, so why change necessarily? All right, let's flip over to defense for a question here, because I think, as you look at position groups for this team, the things that could hold them back, or at least I'm uncertain about, I would start with defensive backs. If there's if Tennessee's making the playoff, that tells me A, Nico's as good as advertised, which I think is probably going to be true, and B, the defensive backs held their own. They weren't a bust. This new look secondary was pretty solid. If they don't make the playoff, it tells me that the secondary probably wasn't particularly solid. So a couple guys to ask you about, Adam. Boo Carter, I know he's one that fans have been wondering about for a while. Is he going to start, do you think, the season opener? And then been hearing some buzz about walk-on Will Brooks at safety. Now, much like playing 6 or 7 wide receivers, something that gets a lot of hype in mid-August are walk-ons in preseason practice. And then what do you know? September rolls around and the walk-ons are third string and the guys on scholarship are the ones starting, and you've forgotten all about that walk-on who was getting the headlines back in August. So Will Brooks, is that real or a preseason narrative without much substance to it that this walk-on is going to start at safety? And then in Boo Carter, what are his chances of starting?
I think the Will Brooks thing is real. I think he's playing at safety. Whether he starts or not, I don't know. I think he'll get equal reps to a couple of other guys in the opener. I think it'll be sort of a tryout to see who works out best. They trust Will Brooks. He does all those things that Tim Banks, the defensive coordinator, loves in his safeties. Knows where to be well, doesn't let guys beat him deep, good communication, all these sort of intangibles. I think there's reason for Tennessee fans who are looking for concerns to be concerned about that, because it's not like a walk-on's taking the job midseason. It's at the beginning of the year, which says this is maybe your best option right now in August. They went into the transfer portal and got a pretty good safety at MTSU, Jacoby Thomas, who's supposed to be, the guy. And if Will Brooks is out there, it means Jacoby Thomas they don't think is the guy, whether he is or maybe they misjudged him or whatever. They've also recruited a couple guys. They let a bunch of guys go in the portal. But I believe the Will Brooks thing, playing a lot, possibly starting at free safety, is real. Now, it's not a reason to completely freak out. Georgia is probably going to start a former walk-on at safety. Arkansas is going to do the same. I think it's Missouri or South Carolina, one of those two. There's like 3 or 4 teams in the SEC besides Tennessee that will likely start a former walk-on at safety in their opener. I say former walk-on because they're put on scholarship later. The difference between Tennessee and them is that Will Brooks has just not been put on scholarship. So maybe if he had been put on scholarship 2 years ago and he's still the same player, people wouldn't mind because they would say he's scholarship worthy. He's just as good as anybody else, but he's still technically a walk-on. I believe that's for real. It'll be interesting to see if he stays back there. Boo Carter at star position, which is Tennessee's nickelback, is as talented, I think, as anybody back there. He's competing with Christian Harrison. That's the son of Rodney Harrison, the longtime great safety for the Patriots. Christian Harrison, to this point in his career at Tennessee, has been an okay, serviceable special teams player that you would project as probably always being an okay special teams player. Before they had some injuries in secondary, like a month ago, if you ask them about Christian Harrison, that's what they would say. He's a guy that's not going to get in the rotation, but he's just a guy back there. He's serviceable. Now he has a chance to start, and he's another one there at the star position. The thing about Boo Carter is the way that the coaches describe him is super talented, makes a ton of difference-making plays, but you still got to work on, the process and the communication, got to work on those things. And to me, that's some buzzwords for he's the best player, but we don't trust him yet. So we'll see. I think Boo Carter is going to play as much as a starter in the first game. Whether or not he starts, I'm a little more skeptical of because they tend to go with the older guy.
I think, Blake, when fans hear that a former walk-on, well, a current walk-on, is could start in the secondary, the reason they get panicky is because this is not a position of strength; it's a position of weakness already, and now it's almost as though you're saying, "Yeah, how good's our secondary? Well, it's so good, anybody can just walk on the team and win a starting position." And what we went through in the off season, we hear these names, all these people transferring in, a lot of defensive backs transferred out. Those transferring in, I would like to think when your secondary is your weakness and you bring in a transfer, he's a starter. He wins the job. If he doesn't, it makes me wonder about the evaluation process.
Yeah, and I think it's a serious concern. I mean, if it's as I pointed out, if Tennessee's going to make the playoff, I think they need Nico to be as advertised, and I think they need the secondary to be better than maybe what I expected to. I have some concerns about this mishmash unit, I guess, of transfers and walk-ons and everything else. And of the two, I'm less trusting of the secondary exceeding my expectations. I trust Nico to play up to the bar. I don't know that I trust the secondary. Where are you guys on that? How much faith do you have in this unit?
Yeah, I have my biggest questions about the secondary just because they weren't proven to begin with, and then there's so many new pieces to that. So I think the combination of the two puts more skepticism around the secondary. I think that's just natural. And also, I think what happens with the secondary has ramifications for this next offseason because they let like 8 guys go into the portal out of the secondary. And boy, if you could have a couple of those guys back now, Wesley Walker, Danico Slaughter, Tamari McDonald, those are all guys that are playing, maybe starting at other schools, and they sort of just let them go. Those guys have the right to go and leave if they want. You can't make them stay. But if the secondary has major issues this year, I think you have to reevaluate like what your priorities are in keeping guys. And that's probably an NIL conversation as well. So I think it has ramifications in the next offseason.
John, I know you're taking in your predictions Tennessee to the playoff. That's no real great reveal here. You've revealed that on this podcast and others throughout the preseason. So do you think Tennessee's secondary is going to maybe exceed the bar, or do you think this offense is going to be so stinking good that you're not that concerned about it?
Well, I would be concerned about the secondary, but I still think the offense will be really, really good. I just go back to the 2022 season. Tennessee's secondary wasn't solid back then. And Tennessee, until it collapsed against South Carolina, was in the running for the playoff. It ended up 11-2 and in the top 10. So, if it could go 10-2 that season with that secondary, if the secondary this year can just play up to 2022 standard, which wasn't that good, particularly when it faced a really competent quarterback. You remember Tennessee, to go back and when you look at that season, the top season for Josh Heupel here is Anthony Richardson passed for about 450 yards for Florida. Tennessee won the game. Bryce Young looked like the Heisman Trophy winner. He got some Heisman votes, and Tennessee won 52-49 over Alabama. It had nothing to do with this. Neither game had anything to do with the secondary playing well. So it's almost as though if the offense is up to the very highest of Heupel's standards, it can overcome what its secondary gives up.
All right, well, the preseason is winding down. You can still find all of Adam's coverage over at KnoxNews.com and John's commentary as well. And we will be back with you next week when it's finally Week 1. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.